Okay, so welcome everyone to this edition of Print Speak. My name is Rebecca Travis. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the curator and collections manager here at Open Studio. We're really excited to have artist Mohammad Tabesh joining us today for this Print Speak talk titled On Resistance and Resilience. Welcome, Mohammad. Before we begin, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. Open Studio acknowledges that it is situated on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. They are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we continue to create and exist. I'll just do a bit of an intro here about PrintSpeak and Open Studio. So we're an artist-run center dedicated to contemporary printmaking. We offer accessible, inclusive, and affordable print facilities, programs, and services for the artists and the public across Canada and abroad. We support artists in creating and exhibiting contemporary print in an open-minded, safe, and collaborative environment. Our vision is to shape the exploration of print as essential, dynamic, and relevant to contemporary culture and creative thought. PrintSpeak is a relatively new virtual education series that focuses on the incredible artists whose work pushes the boundaries of print media. These talks will take you on a journey with each artist to learn about their passion for creating. We just have a couple of housekeeping things. For anyone who is just arriving to the chat, we are recording the session. So if you don't want to be on camera, now's a good time to turn that off. You can put yourself on mute for the talk. This is going to be approximately a 30-minute talk with around 15 minutes for a Q&A afterwards. You can put your questions in the chat or use the raise hand emoji, and we'll get to you at the end of the talk. Today, we are delighted to have Mohammad Tabesh joining us. Mohammad is an artist member here at Open Studio, and we'll have an exhibition in our project space gallery next year. Just a brief intro to Mohammad and his practice. Mohammad's a mixed media artist residing and working in Toronto. His practice is focused on the human condition, the art of resistance, and social change. Through writing, printmaking, multimedia, and sculpture, he explores modes of storytelling in which narrative is embedded in the artwork. He is the 2020 recipient of OCAD University's Sculpture and Installation Medal. In this PrintSpeak session, Mohammad will discuss his latest work, the book of Fading Memories, which is based on his childhood experience of war and violence. Inspired by the book, his art, from medieval illuminated manuscripts to modern-day graphic novels, each turn of the page tells a single story, narrated from two parallel viewpoints, now and then. By sharing these profoundly personal memories, Mohammad avoids the cliché of shock and horrors of war on one hand, and the abstract notion of war as seen from far away on the other. Over to you, Mohammad.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I'll be ready to share my screen if that's okay. And share. And there you go. So hopefully it's visible to everyone.
Looks great.
Perfect. Okay. So thank you again for the introduction. Thank you for giving me a chance to present my work and chat with this wonderful group of artists. For many, many years, I really wanted to write or to convey the stories of my life and people like me to others. And I started thinking about collecting my memories, writing, doodling in early 2000s. And eventually, when I went back later in life to OCAD to study art, I decided to actually continue working on this in a far more serious way. And this became a very big part of my graduating thesis. Then I started working at Open Studio, and that was a wonderful opportunity for me to expand on what I built at OCAD. So I'm gonna just let you know how this talk is gonna work. So I'm just gonna give you a very, very brief introduction to my work, and then I'm gonna focus on my latest work, which is the book. We can explore my artistic practice through this project. And I'm going to talk about the background, why is it important to me, the format of it, and the artists who really influenced me, and also then later we go to the creative writing and the visual language of it, and finally the making of it and what comes next. So I like to consider myself a mixed media artist. And my practice goes from sound installation to ceramics to bronze to printmaking. And in this particular project, I really thought that printmaking is a wonderful medium for me because of this capacity that it has for the narrative work. This work is basically truly fascinating, inspired by book as art. On the center, we have this wonderful book called The Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp. It was a book that was made in the medieval time in Iran, and it took more than 30 years to finish. It took so long that actually the style of drawing is different first page to last page, because different people were working on it. And at some point in modern time, it was cut from its binding and was sold as folios. And a big chunk of it is at the Met in New York. A few pages of it is at Aga Khan Museum, and a bunch of it is actually in Tehran and all over the world. So the story of this book and the travel, the impact of it has always been fascinating to me. And on the far right, we have Persepolis, the comic book by Marjan Satrapi. And she wrote this book originally in French, and it was translated into English in early 2000. And it really impacted the graphic novel and comic work in the Middle East. So basically, she really created a new genre of graphic novels in the Middle East. So those are really inspiring works of art. And before I start talking about the work, I want to pause and share with you what I thought when I started working. And that's these two questions: that why is it important to tell these stories? First of all, it was a long time ago. Actually, people are asking me, why you're torturing yourself remembering what happened 40 years ago? And is it relevant after 40 years? And the other one is, well, you live in Canada now. How is it important now what happened in a different part of the world? So the first question I really thought about, and this is 1979 Iranian Revolution. And I grew up just south of this bridge. And 40 years later, or 35 years later, this is the same bridge. And the same thing is happening. On the right is Tehran Polytechnic, when I studied engineering. And this is the clash of students and the riot police 40 years later. So it is still relevant today. And it is not just Iran, it's everywhere in the world that we need these kind of stories to tell. The other question is, why is it important? It was a different part of the world. So this is Tehran Cemetery, and the woman who was sitting, is mourning the death of her child, I assume, 30, 40 years after what happened. And this was last year, London, Ontario, when the van attack happened, and 5 members of the same family were killed. So it is relevant to all of us to understand and empathize with victims of war and violence. And with that, I started to think about my work. So the format that I chose was based on that large manuscript that I explained. So basically, I started working with folios, and that's what I did. So the way it worked was, I imagined this to be a book, but it was never a book. So they were actually folios, and they were shown side by side. So on the left, you always have a text, and on the right, you always have an image. And each page is actually one single memory. On the left, the text is what I consider to be my thoughts today. So the poem that you're reading is my thoughts looking back at what memory I'm thinking of. And on the right is an image that I imagine I saw as a child. So throughout the book, you see the two very different languages. So the poem or the text is very coherent and very heavy and very cut to the bone. And on the right, you see these images that are either cartoons or illustration or graphic novel style. Although I deviated and did some portraits, and I'm going to explain why I did that. But so yeah, so the start of the project was large format prints. These are 18 by 24 inches prints, and they were supposed to be side by side. So maybe I can actually just tell you an example of what this was. So this is the story of us sleeping during the 1980s Iran-Iraq war. And one of my sisters woke up in a blackout, and she thought that she's blind because the bombing had started. And we told her, no, we can't see anything because it's a blackout. So we went downstairs. And when the bombing was done and we survived, we came back up and we started laughing and making fun of her. So at the very, very top row, we're just children sleeping. And all of a sudden in the middle, we're children of war. And when it's over, we're back to being children again and making fun of each other, pulling each other's legs and so on. So this is the memory. So the way I treated this memory is that the left and right. So now I think, no, silly, you're not blind. We are all blind. It's a blackout. Quick, downstairs. They bombed, we lived. And in the face of horror, we laughed. And on the right, you see the picture that I have in mind of the event that happened that day. And I obviously, this was my first step. So it was the large format folios. And I scaled them down to half. And I created a book. And this is actually the current version that I printed at Open Studio. Same format and everything's the same, except this time is actually a text block. The artists of influence, there are a few things that I really want to mention. One is this child and adult's point of view. And I'll give you two examples that comes to my mind now that I actually look back that I'm done with doing at least the first iteration of my project. And on the left, you have Adventures of Tintin. So I grew up with this. And today, when I look at it, it's pretty racist and it's really, really questionable. But back then, as a child, I never understood those things. And I really read the adventures and I really enjoyed them. So the reason I really like comic books, maybe it's because of Tintin. But as an adult, when I look at these series, I can see racism, bigotry, and cruelty. And on the right, actually, the exact opposite. I always tell people, if you ever read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn as a child, you should read it again. Because as a child, you see adventures and you see them being running away, chasing, and all those things. And as an adult, you see slavery, racism, and bigotry in a positive way, because the writer actually is on the good side of history. So in my work, I think I'm trying to present this child and adult point of view side by side. So when you read the book, you kind of review the story twice. Graphic novels, they do have big impact on my work. I mentioned Persepolis, basically the really successful comic book of the 2000 about a girl who grew up in Iran during the Revolutionary War. And then she published a second volume that was mostly her immigration and going back and forth to Europe and back to Iran. And it inspired a new generation of artists to write comics, like the Lebanese artist Zaina Abi Rashid, and also a really fascinating book, A Game for Swallows, To Die, To Leave, and To Return. So graphic novels, they have really big impact on my work for sure. And the other thing that I want to mention is that I avoid any linear narrative in my work. So these folios are really independent. You can read them independently. They are not in any chronological order. And the two really wonderful examples of that is Kurt Vonnegut's The Slaughterhouse-Five and works by Mario Vargas Llosa. So if you're read and would remember Slaughterhouse-Five, he uses this technique of sci-fi that, you know, the hero of the book is abducted by aliens, so he can travel back and forth in time. And in doing so, he gets to look at his life over and over, but not in a linear chronological way. So he sees glimpses of his life over and over. And that's exactly how I feel about my work. They are related, but loosely related. They're not following one another. Same thing with this book, Conversation in a Cathedral by Mario Vargas Llosa. The narrative is really basically two parallel narratives. So you learn actually as you read the book that there are two timelines, not one. It's very confusing at the beginning, but again, he uses this really masterfully. So on the creative writing part of work, how did I work? My process was to think about a memory, and it was really a state that I was thinking about it over and over and not thinking about anything else. So, and whether I'm sitting on subway, when I'm eating lunch, I'm just reciting some text or some story to myself over and over. And at some point, when I felt like, okay, this is what I want to write, I would write it down, and then I had the process of cutting words from my text, because what I like to do is to write really concise, and really, I write what is necessary, in my opinion. I avoid description. Derek Sullivan was my advisor, and he mentioned that I have one or two adjectives in my entire series, and that's true. I avoid, and then I realized actually that's true. I'm only providing facts very briefly, and I let the reader to be engaged and hopefully empathize with what people go through in this situation. And I can give you a couple of examples, if we have time, on how I wrote about it. So this is a story of me again, as a child, witnessing that my father had to burn all his books because it was too dangerous for him to keep his books. So he had a colleague, he was a teacher, so he had a colleague who called and said, you know what, you have to get rid of these because somebody was arrested and God knows what he's going to say. So as a 5-6-year-old standing in our apartment, I saw that my father made a fire in our bathroom, and now one by one throwing his books into the fire because it was just too dangerous to keep. So I write, one by one, my father burned his books. The cycle of pain, throw, breathe, throw, breathe. A battle inside, the survivor and the intellect. Just when we thought all hope was lost, he tore a poem and hid it under the rug. The intellect lived. And last time I visited Iran, actually, I knew exactly what page was. So he basically paused and took one page from a book and kept it. It was a poem. And it's right here. So what I did was I actually made a copy of this page, which you can see on the right, and then write about it. So the image is actually an accurate image of the page that was torn. And this rip on the left side is actually truly amazing because it shows the act of violence. It shows the act of resistance at the same time. So I go one more memory and then we switch to the visual side of things. So in this memory, my brother went to war as a soldier, my older brother. And there were announcements every night at TV about the casualties of war. So therefore the title Casualty List. And the text goes, sharp at 8 every night on TV, a list. Who lived and who died? Sisters running out, father rocking back and forth. He's alive, he yelled. To be happy just one night. We listened for 186 nights. My brother, he lived. And the image is actually an image of an anchorman. And it's kind of hard to see, but there's a scroll of names that goes through a very pale list of people in Farsi that goes through the page. And those are actually the people who died in one day at war. So the language is pretty, to me, coherent and very concise. And the visual side of things, I really try to experiment because it's like a childlike play. So we did different things at life when we were 6, 7, 8, 9, and I'm trying to do the same thing. So if I feel like it's a replica, I have to recreate a page, that's what I'm going to do. If it's the illustration of a funny looking man, that's what I'm going to do. And if it's a portrait, then I'm going to do a portrait. So this is really depending. So the visual language depends on how I look at that image. I would say half of the book, I followed the graphic novel line drawing style. But I know directly 4 people who died of war, and I decided to do the realistic portrait of them. So instead of going graphic novel cartoonish look, I decided to honor them this way, to actually do a portrait of them. And I'll just go over them really quickly. If you have time, you can always come back and read the text, or you're more than welcome to read the text later. So there was a person who I didn't know, but I always knew his name because his name was on the street, on a very tiny back alley, actually. And he was the first victim of the missile attack on Tehran. So this is one portrait. The other portrait is the portrait of my classmate who went to war as a child soldier, and he died at the age of 15. And the third one is a person that was my neighbor right in front of our house. And he later, like after war, he went to do his military service, and he stepped on a mine and he died that way. There's one deviation, and that's the 4th person that I know was my teacher. And because I wrote the text first, I read the text for you, and then you probably can understand why I didn't do a portrait of him. So the text is Mr. Miri's new home. And it goes, one morning at school, we learned Mr. Miri has a new home, paradise. I do not remember his face, but I remember laughter. And I drew a picture that I remember, and I was playing soccer with him. And that's the deviation from doing the actual portrait. So the visual language really follows how I feel about that event. And the making, I'm very glad to report that finally the book is actually a text block. So this is the stage that it is. And I am in the process of designing the cover. And hopefully, I would say in a month or so, we have the edition of 8 finalized. There are 2 pages that I'd like to share with you also, and those are the end leaves. So when you want to glue the text block to the hardcover, you need a decorative, usually page that is a bit thicker maybe, and that's basically glued to both of them. So basically the book becomes one. So for these 2 end leaves, I decided to write 2 lists. One was the list of, basically the highlight is the name of my friend who was a child soldier. And he was 15. So I went on this database and I found all the people who died in war when they were 15. So this is a list of them. And I just highlighted one showing that I just know this guy, but there are so many of them. Same thing, this is the boy who died in a missile attack, and I highlighted his name. And you can guess, this is the list of people who died in missile attacks, and this is just one of them. So I tried to just use that extra space to do something for them. And what comes next? I like to, again, consider myself a mixed media artist, so maybe my next step is not necessarily print. Maybe I can do something else with them. So I have experimented with that too. And I give you 2 examples, and I wrap up my talk with that. The first one is the map. And this is the story of me and my brother playing a game And we had map of Tehran, and every time there was an explosion, we would put a circle where the explosion was, like a jigsaw puzzle or something, right? And so the text goes, we played a game, my brother and I, a map, a pen, and for every explosion, a black circle. Soon, the map was covered with deep black scars. Soon, we realized we are in this game. So we actually realized that there are lots of dots around us. And at some point, we stopped this game. And I've done other things with this map. And one of them is that actually I did a chalk drawing on the floor of a gallery. And it was an interesting experience because now people who enter this room, they have a different viewpoint. And they can play the pilot, or they can play the god, and they can walk on this map. Or they can avoid doing that. And this was an interesting experience to just watch how people interact with this artwork. The other one is, and it's my last example, is the multi-faith prayer room. And that's based on the fact that people would shelter under staircase when it was bombing. And on the right, you see 3 people on something that looks like a staircase, and the far corner is an airplane, and there's just blackness in between. And I remember when we were under the staircase, our neighbor was Armenian, so they were Christians. And so they would pray to a different God in a different language. But we all obviously wanted to have the same. So the text goes, different tongues, different gods. Please keep us safe, we prayed and prayed. They listened to some, but not all. So I did a sound installation based on that because it's very musical, it's very oral. So I'm just gonna play this for you. Hopefully you can hear it. And with that, I think my time's up, and we can get to the question and answers. So this is the sound installation version of Multi-Faith Prayer Room. Let's hope you can hear it. Just give us a few seconds and start.
Padre nuestro, Espíritu Santo, guárdanos del mal, guárdanos, protégenos.
하나님, 제발 저희를 안전하게 해주세요.
Padre, cuídame, perdóname por mis transgresiones.
하나님, 제발 우리 가족을 안전하게 지켜주세요.
Padre, cuídame, perdóname por mis
저는
transgresiones.
좋은 사람이 되겠습니다. 약속할게요.
Padre nuestro, cuídanos.
하나님, 제발 우리를 도와주세요. 하나님, 제발 저희를 안전하게 해주세요.
Perdóname por mis transgresiones.
하나님,
Padre,
제발 우리 가족을
cuídame.
안전하게
perdóname
지켜주세요.
por mis
저는
transgresiones.
좋은 사람이
Padre
되겠습니다.
nuestro, cuídanos.
약속할게요.
Padre
하나님,
nuestro, Espíritu Santo,
제발
guárdanos
우리를
del mal,
도와주세요.
guárdanos,
하나님,
protégenos.
제발 우리 가족을 안전하게 지켜주세요.
That's it.
That was great. Thank you so much, Mohammed. So I think we're going to turn it over to questions now. And as mentioned, you can do that either by writing a question in the chat box, or you can raise your hand emoji and we'll get to you one by one. And just to kind of kick things off, I thought I'd ask you a little bit about the actual print processes you've been using as well. So it was really clear about your sort of literary influences and the graphic novel influences, and you've been mainly working in the screen printing area. So what
Mhm.
was it that drew you to working with screen printing specifically for this book project?
Yeah, good point. And I noticed that actually I haven't talked about the print process itself because it was just so much to pack in half an hour, but you're absolutely right. I experimented with different media, especially letterpress and screen printing. And I found that screen printing is just really natural to go because of the line drawing. And I think I experimented and I just found that's my language. And I think it's really powerful. It's a powerful tool if you have line drawings like what the images that you see here. And it's quick. You can be really working in the graphic novel style, and you can easily scale it up and down. So for those reasons, actually, I find that screen printing is really suitable for my practice.
Yeah, I can see that. And we talked a bit in the studio also about the sort of the logistics behind making a book. So it's interesting to me that you have these quite intuitive and non-linear narratives in the book, but the way that you've had to construct it is very, very logical. Could you talk a bit about like the construction of the book itself as well?
Yeah, you mean the material that I put together in the book, or the actual physical making of the book? Sorry.
A bit of both. Like I know you had to plan a lot for like what would be on each side of the page and
Yes.
things like that.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, when I started, so when it was folios, it was easy because it was individual prints that I would make, and it was one-sided, and I just put it side by side. So it's a lot easier. But when you think about making a book, as you said, you have to think about the signatures, because obviously when you do the binding process, you put some folded sheets together, and then you start the sewing process. So I did make tiny little booklets out of just regular paper, and I wrote on them what I want. And again, I did not emphasize any kind of timeline that this should follow that. It just felt like, okay, I want to do this, I want to do that, and that's I want to do this is the order of the book, basically. So it felt like, so definitely without any doubt, the one that I did for my father, that was the very first one that I made. And I remember thinking that if I can't make something out of this memory, I should not be an artist. So I went in and made this first page. I remember that. And that's actually, again, the first page of my book. So even in the second iteration, this was there. I think it sums up the title of the talk, that is Resistance and Resilience. And it was a very touching and deep memory for somebody who was 5 or 6. And yeah, but you're right. I have to plan, okay, what goes behind this page and what's the next to that. So I made this replica of each signature, and I started printing. So it is the core of the book is 4 signatures, and then I have to add introduction, title, half title, and those things, and at the very end the edition number. So I think overall the book that is actually here, I can show you, is made of 7 signatures. So yeah, it's a lot of calculation that goes toward making sure these things are centered, fully registered, and there's so many layers, because one page of a book could have, I don't know, 10, 12 layers, and you want to make sure that they're all well printed. But I have to add one thing that I actually was thinking today, and for the whole process, I was actually thinking about it. Being a perfectionist and being a printmaker, I really was worried that how I'm going to finish this project, knowing how many things can go wrong on every single page. And there is a poem by Rumi that I kept repeating to myself. And that, I think, is very helpful to any printmaker or many artists. So I would go in Farsi first, and then I translate it. So the poem in Farsi is, قافیه اندیشم و دلدار من گویدم مندیش جز دیدار من. And if you translated it, the Rumi is talking about himself. He said, my job is to make rhymes, because he's a poet, right? And my beloved tells me, think about me and nothing else. So he basically is saying that, I lose track of why I'm writing the poem, because I'm so obsessed with the rhymes. And I keep repeating that to myself that, the stories are important and printmaking should come naturally after that. So that's how I kept my sanity and managed to print all of this without being so frustrated.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it really comes through how like profoundly personal the work is. And I'm really excited to see it kind of all finally come together, having seen it in various stages at the studio over the last few months. And it was interesting, you just sort of mentioned that poem and read it in Farsi and in English. And I wanted to ask actually a bit about that combination of language that appears in the work as well, and how you decide what will be Farsi and what will be in English, and just, I guess, your experience of those two languages as well.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. English is my second language, so I'm always nervous thinking about writing in English, not to mention writing, I don't know, poetry. And but for this book, I decided to write in English. And to me, it was the first time that actually it's hard for me to translate this into Farsi. So it's always been the other way around. This time, I feel like this body of work is really written in English. And if I want to show this one day in Iran, I have some work to do, because it takes some time to, because I developed this really concise language, and translating from one language to another is going to be a really challenge.
Yeah, I can't imagine, but I think it's really interesting that you still work with both. And you were talking about that sort of duality of having childhood memories and adult reflections, and it feels like the language also is part of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, two viewpoints. I have a question in the chat here from Laura. It's asking, how does the idea of multiples influence or impact your work? Is it perhaps because you can disseminate these stories more widely? Absolutely.
It's absolutely true. I really like printmaking because it's naturally a multiple, and you can, yeah, I love printmaking because you can always reach a wider audience. You can always have edition after edition, and it's quite important. For sure. Yeah, absolutely. Even in my other works, I like to work with series on multiples, whether it's ceramics, whether it's I made a bunch of animated GIFs, and they are numbered. So I really like the idea of having multiples. And I also like the idea of having lists that go through. So the work is always numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth.
Yeah, I have a bit of a question around that sort of mixed media practice too. Do you find you start working with a medium and then you sort of establish a project through that particular medium, or are you constantly sort of thinking and then you're applying different concepts to different media that you've worked in before and seeing what kind of fits best? Do you have a kind of structure for that?
Yeah, so what is my thought process? I think when I write a proposal, either for myself or to get a grant, I think about what is the appropriate medium to use, and then I follow that. So for the printmaking, this is probably the 3rd or 4th year that I'm working on this project as a print project. But I definitely think about how else can I tell this story? Because to me, my practice, even here I mentioned it, it's the art of storytelling. It's not the art of print or art of video art. So to me, it's the storytelling that is really fascinating. So if I can tell a story by print, that's great. If I can tell the same story by video, this is even better.
Yeah, I think that really comes through in the way that you've talked about the work as well. And I just wondered if anyone else has any questions before we do start to wrap up. And if not, Mohammad, I know you have a show at the moment at OCAD, and I just wondered if you wanted to say a couple of things about that and just let people know when and where they can see it.
Yeah, I have a group show at OCAD at the moment, and I sent you it's at Ignite Gallery at a main OCAD building. It's called To You, from me for us. It's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 artists in total. And it's a pretty fascinating show. We were supposed to have that in 2019. And because of the pandemic, it was pushed back year after year after year. So we finally have this opportunity to show the work. And it's all about identity, like 3 of my prints plus 1 bronze and 1 ceramic pieces there. That's my pieces. And there are sound installation, there are large format sculptures and wall drawings. So it's a really, really interesting show, I would say, to go and visit.
Okay. Pamela is just asking how long the exhibition is on for. Laura shared a link in the chat there, which has some extra information.
I think early August, but I have to double check. They extended it. It was supposed to be done by now, but we have a few more days for that show. But the link is, I sent you the link, so maybe you can share it.
Yeah, it's in the chat now. Well, I think I'll speak for everyone, just saying thank you so much for sharing about your work. And like we were saying, the work is so personal and it's such a privilege to hear you speak about it. I can't wait to see the book finished and to continue kind of hearing about how it's being shaped in the studio. And as mentioned, Mohammad will have a show with us next year, so do keep your eyes out for that. Thanks everyone for joining the Print Speak session. If you've missed the previous Print Speak talks, they're available on our YouTube channel. We're just working on uploading the last couple there, but Laura shared the link in the chat, so some of our previous talks. If you'd like to know more about Open Studio, we're also going to share the general website link there. If anyone here is new to us as an organization, please do check out the website. Thanks again, Mohammad, and everyone for joining us today, for taking some time out of this really hot summer we're having to sit down and hear about some of the amazing work that Mohammad is making. If you do have any questions after this, then please just send us an email. Laura will put the email in the chat. And as always, the Print Speak sessions are free, but we do also sort of encourage donations. If you feel willing, if you've enjoyed the talk, then please do donate as well. Otherwise, have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the sunshine today, and we'll hopefully see you again for another Print Speak in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate you being here.